it's also a bill that addresses some of the very serious, tough issues and risks that companies face in these industries when they operate in very, very tough places around the world. So from a business operating point of view, from an investor point of view, and I dare say, even if I can say so, from a Canadian foreign policy point of view, it's important for companies to be able to address the real risks on the ground and yet still be able to operate in some of these very difficult places around the world, whether in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, or elsewhere. In the U.S., we have been making progress on extractives and human rights, perhaps more even than one would have expected, given some of the other directions that our foreign policy went in during the previous administration. But I'm delighted by the new energy that the Obama administration is giving to the voluntary principles on security and human rights, which is the core human rights standard now for the oil and mining industries around the world, and one of the focal points of this legislation. I'm also particularly delighted by the fact that the U.S. Congress passed, as part of the Wall Street financial reform package in July, and President Obama signed into law, provisions which require all oil and mining companies that are registered with the SEC, our Securities and Exchange Commission, in order to be traded in U.S. stock exchanges, requires all those oil and gas companies for the first time to disclose revenue payments that they make to the governments and companies where they operate all around the world. And this is an extraordinary achievement. It frankly took some of our friends in the oil and to a lesser extent mining industries in the U.S. by some surprise, but it really complements the progress that we're already making through the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, EITI. And ultimately at stake here is not just revenue transparency to satisfy accountants, but revenue transparency to open up government.
I think most of us, or most of you, know what is going on with Canadian mining companies abroad. And I should not go on that because there's a lot of information out there. What is important is that some countries, when I was at the Secretary of Environment of Argentina, we struggled very hard to put some control on mining sector. And as you know, any private sector, they don't like to be controlled. But you need to know that they will use
I happen to sit on National Advisory Panel for something called Responsible Care, which is a chemistry industry initiative that arose after two very unhappy incidents. One was the Mississauga train derailment. There was a cloud of toxic chemicals that caused the largest evacuation in Canadian history. And then, of course, there was the Bhopal incident. And it was in a way sad to see an industry have to shift from a position in which the thought of accountability mechanisms were a cost to a point where they had to say, we need accountability mechanisms for our own reputation, for the protection of our own reputation. So today, it turns out that the chemical industry has and wants to have a public complaints process, wants to have the ability to say, if our standards are breached, there are ways for having people to check whether those standards are breached. So my fear is that the Canadian mining industry will, after some parallel disaster, and we know that there are disasters in the making in Argentina and elsewhere, come running to Parliament, looking, in fact, for a good housekeeping seal of approval to say, yes, you know, you can accept Canadian companies in Argentina, you can accept Canadian companies in Papua New Guinea. We stand behind the environmental and human rights obligations that we claim to have taken on. So what looks today like a cost to the Canadian mining industry, in fact, is an investment, I believe, in its own reputation in the future. If you ask yourself the question, would you rather have the Norwegian government tell Barrick Gold that its operations in Papua New Guinea violate environmental standards, or have a Canadian process warn them in advance that they better look after their reputations? What would you rather have? And it turns out, of course, as you know, that the Norwegian government has already said publicly, we've withdrawn our monies from Barrick Gold because you're in violation of standards that you're held up to in Canada. You're dumping arsenic into rivers that you would not be allowed to do in your own country. Do we like to have a situation in which it's foreign governments telling our companies to live up to their own standards?
I'd like to know if the Liberal Party is really interested in kind of governing and accepting responsibility to bring this bill forward and have it passed and let the chips fall where it may. Are they worthy of people actually placing trust in them, having power, and helping govern the country as people would like to see governed? That's my question. I think any member of the caucus can answer that.
Well, the politics are that the NDP is in favor, the Bloc is in favor, the government is against, and like a lot of issues around here, the Liberal Party by default or otherwise gets to decide. And it's by no means clear that enough members of the caucus are persuaded in order to be able to decide. The Liberal Party is that big red tent after all. We do have within that big red tent enormous diversity of views, and some of which are reconcilable and some of which are not. It's pretty clear what my own view is, that the Liberal Party historically has stood in favor of international human rights. We are, after all, the party of Trudeau. We are, after all, the party of Pearson. We are the party of the Charter, and there's a reckoning that will take place, and it might actually take place the week Wednesday. So, I'm not going to ask for another question from you, Shaun.
No,
that's just wrong. Yeah. I know Joanne Deschamps, en français, vous voudrez parler, s'il vous plaît?
Alors bonsoir, je vais être la partie francophone de cet événement et je tiens absolument à dire l'importance de la tenue d'un événement comme aujourd'hui, à la veille du vote qui va se tenir mercredi prochain. Et évidemment, M. McKay a besoin des partis d'opposition pour que son projet de loi puisse avoir une grande majorité. Alors pour le Bloc, évidemment, nous allons appuyer le projet de loi C-300 parce que selon nous, ce projet de loi, c'est un pas dans la bonne direction. Ce projet de loi va offrir aussi un premier outil législatif. Et puis, je pense qu'il est grandement temps que le Parlement canadien adopte une loi qui encadre les activités des compagnies extractives canadiennes à l'étranger. Nous savons tous actuellement qu'il n'existe aucun mécanisme adéquat pour encadrer. Yes, merci. Yeah! Pour encadrer les activités des compagnies minières, pétrolières et gazières canadiennes à l'étranger. Alors, le Bloc québécois a toujours défendu la nécessité d'imposer des normes de responsabilité sociale aux entreprises lorsqu'elles mènent des activités à l'étranger. Alors, c'est pour cette raison que nous sommes en faveur du principe de C-300. Et finalement, je pense que le projet de loi de M. McKay, ce qu'il a favorisé finalement, c'est un débat. Nous avons entendu au cours des derniers mois plusieurs témoins qui sont venus au Comité des affaires étrangères en tant qu'individus, en tant qu'organisation de la société civile, nous faire part des pratiques et dénoncer surtout les exactions et les pratiques douteuses qu'ont certaines compagnies minières canadiennes à l'étranger. Alors, le gouvernement doit reconnaître la gravité de la situation et doit s'engager aussi à adopter des mesures obligatoires pour presser les compagnies extractives canadiennes à opérer de manière.
People that are visiting and talking to some of the MPs have said, well, you know, if Canadian companies pull out, we're going to see Chinese companies move in. And they have a track record, you know, going back to Talisman, for instance. There's a track record of the Chinese just moving in, which just makes things worse. So, like I said, I know how I answer that particular question, but I'd like to hear how you respond to that.
I think it's much cheaper to fix, to behave well for a company than to pull out from a country. And we're not looking for Canadian companies to pull out. We're looking for Canadian companies to work well. And if one needs to pull out because cannot decides that doesn't want to fulfill human rights standards and environmental standards, then it will be a place for a good Canadian company to come in, not necessarily a Chinese Canadian company to come in. So it's just I wanted to say that.